This is The Writing Game, and I'm Gregory Palaci. Video games owe a lot to comic books, not just because they're both part of nerd culture, but because they're both visual mediums doing storytelling. Comics have affected every creative industry to become one of the most influential sources of stories and intellectual property. But comics, of course, do more than that. They also speak to us as fairy tales, fables, and epic sagas once did. They are those very things for our time. So, in honor of Stan Lee, who recently passed away, it occurred to me that I should do a follow-up episode to Soap Opera Antics, and here it is, Comic Book Antics. The pleasure of reading a story and wondering what will come next for the hero is a pleasure that has lasted for centuries, and I think will always be with us. Stan Lee. Comic books as a form are diverse, crazily so. So, what we discuss here is hardly likely to hold true for all of them, in part because the structures of comics ranges from the daily strips in newspapers and webcomics to serialized releases, more commonly associated with the medium. But then there's also miniseries, limited runs, one-shots, and of course, graphic novels. Some of these have a consistent storyline throughout, some do not. Variety abounds in the comic book realm, which is fantastic because, like novels, they show a versatility in their form. People new to the medium have to be taught how to read them, just like in video games, because it isn't immediately obvious all the time which order the panels go in. Traditional comic strips from newspapers were always quite clear, given their left to right, or if the language calls for it, right to left format. Writers of comic books should be concerned with the gutters, because it's their story being told, and if the progression isn't clear, then information is lost. It's the same issue in games and plot-relevant information. Did it only occur during a cutscene, or in an offhanded remark by some minor NPC that the player likely wasn't listening to? Or was it hidden in some book or audio diary that only 1 in 100 players finds? More than that, they're both visual mediums, and ones where the images have to do a lot of heavy lifting. Games have the added benefit of music, sound effects, motion, and voiced lines, but each is still heavily dependent on the visuals to impart their meaning. These are all simple lessons one can learn from comic books, but the same could be learned from movies, plays, and TV just as easily. For now, let's leave the concepts aside and look at what we can learn from writing a comic book and how that applies to writing a video game. It would be fair to say that a lot of what comic books do, soap operas also do. And so if you haven't watched or listened to the episode on Soap Opera Antics, then I suggest you do so now. In part to save me from repeating those very same points. Plus, you can pause this episode and I will wait indefinitely. One of the greatest differences between the soap opera and the comic book, and something shared by the latter with video games, is the poetics of the art. Or, as Wikipedia describes it, the understanding of how a text's different elements come together and produce certain effects on the reader. Austin Walker, the editor-in-chief of Waypoint, recently spoke about this very aspect of games in comparing Red Dead Redemption 2 and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. In that case, it was the difference in how the games treat the player in relation to the game world. Other games mentioned were Fire Emblem, XCOM, The Missing, Dark Souls, Demon Souls, and Bloodborne. In each of these cases, the issue at hand was whether or not the story being told was something representational of larger issues, something comic books have been great at addressing. As mentioned by the Waypoint crew, Fire Emblem is about people dating set against a war. XCOM is about a squad of soldiers in a war. The Missing is about accepting oneself and one's sexuality and or gender, while the From Software series are about history. Superheroes in comic books are often telling very personal stories, similar to those in soap operas, but without the world-ending consequences. Or more correctly, the comic books have the world-ending consequences. Soap operas tend not to. For all that hullabaloo, the trappings, they are often stories concerned with smaller, more intimate odds. The poetics in this case point to something other than the world ending. In Spider-Man's case, it's the responsibility that comes with power. For the X-Men, it's about discrimination, overcoming and accepting differences. And Batman is about the responsibilities the wealthy have to society. Sean Coyne writes about this in the story grid. It's never couched as poetics, and that's concerned with the final creation. Rather, he speaks of external and internal genres, the former being what the protagonist wants, the latter being what they need. Comic books are great at visualizing the conflict between the wants and needs of characters. Spider-Man in particular, with his desire to protect and his need to be a normal person. The writer has to think visually when writing comic books. They have to describe static moments when the action is captured to get all of that across. In effect, the writer has to be concerned with the poetics of the comic book, much in the same way a writer should be concerned with the same when working on a game. Of course, writers aren't always able or allowed to be that concerned when working as part of larger teams. In that case, it's likely something for the creative director to be concerned with. The beauty of comic books and writing them is, of course, the versatility in form. As mentioned before, comics can be anything from a single image to a multi-volume historical account. Experimentation is rife within comic books. For the same, in video games, we have to look to the indie scene. And yes, comic books have their own indie scene, but even the big players experiment. Take Matt Fraction's run on Hawkeye, and doing an entire issue from the perspective of Pizza Dog. Or Scott Snyder's Batman Metal. That's Marvel and DC respectively trying new things without relying on imprints to test things out. Video games are weird in their relationship to indies, in part because the flagship AAA titles we've come to know and love or loathe were all pretty indie at the beginning. Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Call of Duty weren't always the big standardized productions we know today. Story-wise, they weren't necessarily trying anything new either. Games like the Stanley Parable, Virginia, The Magic Circle, Jazz Punk, and Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy are in turn reflections of the AAA space, and what's become so standard and accepted. Yet, in turn, have become instructive to the very types of games they're commenting on, because of what they're doing with both story and mechanics. The experimentation of comic books and how it pervades the medium, affecting everything from the writing, art, production, and sales, demonstrates that the fear of the unknown or too much change is unfounded. One doesn't have to do just a small twist on a proven formula to be successful, or even rely on old tropes. Of course, you're bound to encounter that cadre of fans that despises any changes, but without change, we don't get stories like Logan, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, or Persepolis, which all started in comic form and went on to other mediums. The other thing to remember is fan is short for fanatic, and there's no reasoning with a fanatic. Comics are without a doubt the best at justifying utter bullshit. Science, mythology, geography goes completely bananas, especially in the mainline stories of the big two. And yet, we buy it. We eat it up. We believe a person can gain the abilities and proportional strength of a spider, or with enough training and preparation, can have a plan for all occasions. We're presented with a meticulously thought out universe in which there's a clear delineation of what's possible and what isn't, with relevant justifications and classifications. There's a whole taxonomy to the abilities present in comic books. This is both good and bad. More on that in a moment. because it's had a clear impact on games, namely in our incessant search for balance and justification for the abilities players are given. Brandon Sanderson has also been a major influence in this regard, as he clearly sets out magic systems that are gamified. Back to the issue of explanations. Comic books wholly own their absurdity. They recognize that things aren't always going to make sense, but they try to justify it anyways. And that's admirable. That's a lesson to be learned from, because too often games don't do this. Their tone veers wildly. Part of that is the player's fault, but it's also tied to how consistent the gestalt of a game is with the writing, story, art, and mechanics all conveying the same thing. Something I seem to be endlessly repeating throughout this series. So, moving on, or more accurately, back to Stan Lee. He's a man who told a lot of stories in comics and always had something interesting ideas in regards to them. The first and most famous is that every comic book is somebody's first. So you always have to introduce everything. The characters, the world, the powers, the causes, even how to read the comic. For games, this really isn't anything new. It's why sequels have tutorials. Lee's second rule, as it were, is that every character needs a backstory that justifies their action. It's why Uncle Ben or Martha and Thomas Wayne need to die. There is value in knowing what motivates your characters. However, that doesn't need to be shown or explored to the extent the movies like to do. How many times have we been shown the death of Batman's parents at this point? Or what about the origin of Spider-Man? And the move to just have a superhero in their own element is fantastic, but more on backstories in a future episode. Of course, the need for a backstory or a cause also extends to villains. Comics are great at villains, in part because they take the time to explore the villain and make them the hero of their own story. They're not always some maleficent force, unseen, but acting to hinder the protagonist. That cause extends to every aspect of a character and their actions. If they've got a cape or rocket boots, or a million pockets, there needs to be a justification for such things. It's not enough for something to sound or look cool. The Stan Lee Owns video is proof enough of that.
But I have a question I've been wanting to ask you guys. How long does it take these people to get dressed, these kind of characters?
Who says they undress?
I mean, there's something they have to get out quickly to save the world, but it takes them an hour and a half to get into all of this stuff if they work fast.
But why don't we give them here wires coming out here, coming down up?
They love that
the kids
stuff.
love wiring.
The wires that he'll trip over.
Why don't we
when he's
invite-
running.
Oh, yeah.
That video is courtesy of H Bomber Guy on YouTube. Canon is one of those things that's often the hardest elements of a work for creators to grasp. Everyone's a critic, and everyone has their own idea of what is and isn't part of what makes the universe or characters so interesting. Comic books are, of course, one of the oldest battlegrounds for this sort of fight. It's here that games should look to for additional inspiration. Comics take risks. They reboot entire universes, wipe out past histories, or simply shelve something as a one-shot in its own mini-verse. Comics respect canon, but know not to always let it get in the way. To some degree, we see this in anthology-style games like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and the Final Fantasy series. Granted, the first tries to have a connected world, the second is only minor elements or characters that are shared, and the third is wholly independent to one another, as far as I understand. Don't quote me on that. I don't play, nor have I ever played Final Fantasy. The anthology approach can spawn whole subcultures dedicated to figuring out how each game is connected. The Legend of Zelda or the Mario Brothers timeline theories, for example. Each involves meticulous examination of the game's events in relation to other games in the series. And in researching this little tidbit, I found out that there's an official timeline for the Zelda theory that confirms much of what fans speculated. But the anthology approach also allows for new configurations of characters, timelines, plots, and more. It allows teams to vary their membership, for enemies to become friends, or for characters to switch genders or sexuality or ethnicity. And the last statement is not meant to dismiss Iceman coming out as gay or keep Bishop as Hawkeye, nor Miles Morales. Rather, it's to illustrate that these ideas can transcend the original concept, that the characters can be so much more and more inclusive. They don't just have to be white people. Of course, those are best when they happen in the mainline comics and not just one-shots or miniseries. But that versatility of characters is something that games can and should adapt more readily. The last thing I can say about comic books is to try writing them. The very act of working in a different medium is educational. Comics, though, require you as a writer to freeze moments and figure out what's most visually appealing, all while maintaining the pacing between those moments and interspersing them with limited dialogue. In addition, you're generally writing in the present tense, similar to how you're meant to write movies. The constraints of comic books are fantastic rules by which to get writing. And this series, if it's about anything, is about finding those constraints that get you writing. Of course, in this episode, I didn't even touch on manga or non-American comic books. They will have their own lessons, and maybe I'll do an episode on them in the future. For now, thanks for taking part in this episode of The Writing Game. I'm Gregory Palacci. Everything I do can be found at onegamedad.com, and I can be reached there or on Twitter at onegamedad if you want to talk about writing, games, this show, or even working together. And of course, if you enjoy what I do, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/onegamedad. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe, or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode.